Henry asked me to talk about the role and place of military science in the Russian military system. It's been there for a long, long time. It differentiates their military culture from ours. Our military is the heir of Jomini, if you know that name, dear old Henri. And the essence of Jomini was to say, tactics is an art. Strategy may be something with science, but war is not a science. The Russians, in fact, say no. In fact, there is something called military science. They have an institution called the Academy of Military Sciences, run by a dear old general who served in the Great Patriotic War, a man by the name of Gareev, a front veteran who founded this organization in 1995, and I think I had something to do with its creation, because he had published a book on future war, If War Comes Tomorrow, in 1995. And he was in the United States, and he kept asking me, where is your military science? Any of you know where military science shows up in the curriculum for our officers' education? ROTC. There's a course of military science there. Not exactly high-flown. There may be a whisper about Clausewitz there, but we give that to them at Command General Staff College in the Army, other places. It comes much later, and it's certainly not presented as military science. We present it as the good Prussian meant it to be. It is not Jomini. It does not have principles that lay out how, indeed, war will be conducted, because the core and critical point here is you need military science to engage in what? To engage in the look at the nature of future conflict. Gareev has the best words I know of to describe that process. It's called the Labor of Sisyphus. Anything you do about assessing where you are, where probable opponents are, is only temporally good now, and it will be changed by the forces that are in fact going to act on you, on technology, on the world around you, and therefore it has to be an ongoing process, permanently driven. If you look at the Russians, I can tell you that science is there. Great slide on it. Peter Great went to Holland and England, in Holland to learn to build ships, and in England to learn how the British organized their admiralty. Not a bad thing to figure out in the 17th century. What he brought back, he brought Newton's Principia back, and he put it into the library of the School of Mathematics and Navigation. From the very beginning, science is part of what will be the modern Russian military. By the beginning of the 19th century, the main staff of the Russian army has a director of military science. Throughout their history, they have had a reliance on military science as how they, in fact, go about looking at future conflict. Now, for our purposes, very shortly, right now we have a very, what I'll call, serious problem in our own military culture, because one of the distinctions between us and the Russians is they have a very high context language about military affairs. If a term is used, it in fact has an official definition, it applies in certain areas, and by God, that's what it's about. We we have a low context military culture. If you doubt that, how many of you gone to one of our military schools, say, for instance, Command General Staff College, or, say, Navy Postgraduate School? We have words which come into use. We have acronyms that are created out of terms. And what you will discover is there's no body which says this is what everything means. This is an official definition of this. In fact, what we have is terms that are driven by whoever said them. And if you want to understand our military culture really well, watch what words get capitalized. In the first decade of, well, how should you put this? When Mr. Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense, he gave us the word transformation. And I had a standing offer of $5 for the first thesis I got at SAMS, which did not have transformation capitalized. Why was it capitalized? Because it had been spoken by authority. When the authority is no longer Secretary of Defense, does it still have a capital T? No, it doesn't. The Russians have dictionaries of military terminology in spades. We actually translated one for NATO, God bless us. That was something that Andy did, into French, German, and English. The Russians come at these things with a great deal of rigor. They think that, in fact, what they're doing is trying to figure out what future war is. And I will go back to you and say, when does the notion of future war appear? When do people start thinking about it? Well, it appears when you begin to look at technological dynamism. When military is being transformed by technology in the battlefield. American Civil War. What stands out about that war? New armaments, but old tactics, right? We got people armed with rifles, and they're deploying like they're super muskets. Consequence of that, if you're going to march 400 yards across the battlefield, which when it's muskets, nobody can hit you to out beyond 100 yards, when you get rifles, you march in formation, you will die in large numbers. And any of you who've been to Pickett's Charge can understand exactly how that works. Adaption of tactics, adaption to new technologies, drives looking at future war. The Brits do a book by military officers, journalists, various and sundry prominent individuals, called The Great War of 1890, in which England is allied with Germany, and the Russians and the French are on the other side, and it looks very much like the wars of Moltke. Short, decisive, right? Well, in 1898, there's a book, 6 volumes, published by a Pole, railroad magnate, called Future War. Jan Bloch. And what he says is future war is not going to be like Moltke's wars. It's going to be mass industrial war. It's likely to have stalemate because defense will dominate offense. And you're going to have a risk of the war itself consuming the rear of society and leading to revolutionary upheaval. Now, that may not look like what happened in England or the United States, but if you look at Russia, you look at Germany, you look at Austria, you look at Turkey, it looks pretty much it's exactly what the dynamics of that war were about. Russians come out of their experience in World War I saying, we've got to be able to look at this, and one of the things that the state needs is a unified military doctrine. Now, let me point out to you that we use doctrine at the drop of a hat. Everything's doctrine. The Russians, if they're talking about doctrine, it is literally about the summa theologica of how the state prepares and conducts future war. Who are you going to fight? We're going to fight them. What you're going to fight them with, what your political objectives are. Those are supposed to be built into and part of the war plan. And what goes along with that is a massive country study of here is the opponent we're fighting, and here are his strengths and weaknesses. In 1921, a fellow by the name of Sasarev, an old Doris officer, did one of those studies for Afghanistan. You know when it was dug out? 1979. It was used as basis for planning for the operations updated, but it was used as what was handed out for it. This is a way to look at Afghanistan. That's an old book, but the point is if you do it right, if you get the terrain right, if you get the population dynamics right, you get the economic structure, the sort of thing, that indeed gives you a framework to look for. Andy Marshall did a document of that order on the Soviet plan for, in fact, going into Iran in 1941. And I would suspect the Russians still have something like that in case there's inclemency in the Caspian and they have to go in, probably as far south as Tehran. Think about that. That means not objective to conquer all of Iran, but in fact to establish a Russian zone of control in the north. Why is that? Because the populations up there are different than the Persians. They're Azeris. And you can play on that tension between Persian and Azeri to justify what you're in fact doing. Are the Russians looking at that area right now? It's very interesting to me. They've moved the headquarters of the Caspian flotilla. The boys who have the calibers that were fired into Syria, they used to be based out of Astrakhan. Way up north, beginning of Caspian Sea, they are now literally based on the Azeri border. The fleet has been moved south, and they interact now with the Iranians, which is a new development. The Russian Navy has been down there before, but they have not been doing exercises with the Iranians. So there's things here happening. What I'm trying to say to you is the scientific nature is at the center of Russian military system. Does it mean that the political leadership absolutely accepts it? No. In 1979, the General Staff, Ogarkov, had a plan for going into Afghanistan if they had to. 35 divisions. The political leadership said, no, this can be like Prague, and we'll use a minimal force, about 6, it'll be okay, everything's fine. Gariev and I used to have discussions, particularly after we had our brilliant success in knocking out the Taliban, and he would look at me and say, wait for February. I go, what the hell is February? Nobody campaigns in Afghanistan in February. The passes are closed. He said, that's not the issue. In February 1980, the Politburo made a decision without any support from the General Staff to change the mission of the Soviet forces in Afghanistan, to go from occupation of cities into actual physical support of the Afghan army in the field on the assumption that Soviet assistance would shift the balance. What the Politburo did with one fell stroke was change a civil war between factions inside Afghanistan into an Afghan-Soviet war. And from February on, the military is going, how the hell do we get out of this? And all of the machinations, all the strategic changes, all the change in tactics, all the change in mix of forces is to get out. Not go further. There's never any plan to go into Pakistan. take Baluchistan, it's how do we get out, how do we avoid escalation, and that is something they do. They get about 107,000 in, and they never go above 120,000. The lesson out of that, which the folks in the General Staff in the 1990s would tell you about, is the military must, in fact, have a clear and key role in deciding what the nature of operations are. And that, right now, is where the Russian military looks. There's a new book out by Alexander Goltz. He's a Russian military journalist. I've known him since 1990. I don't know how he's still independent, but he continues to write. He just published a book by Jamestown. This is the Jamestown Foundation. This is the plug for what people pay by way sometimes. And the book is called Russian Military Reform and Militarism. That last word is something we have not heard before. And it is a manifestation of the fact that the Russian military system is moving away from where it was, which was an army in its reform period after 2008 down to 2014, where the emphasis was on contract military personnel as opposed to conscripts, where it was clearly on the notion of relatively small forces, brigade organized, and it is now moving back to conscript, echelonment, and preparation for general war. That's at least what the Western Military District looks like. The Western Military District, which is everything looking at NATO, looking at Scandinavia, looking at the Balkans, is now organized to look like a force very much closer to what the Soviet Union had than what Russia has been able to field down to 2014. Whether they can man this, whether there in fact are forces to sustain echelonment, is very, very much open to question. There have been advocates for such a military force. Gareev has been one of them. There was a book called Future War, published in 2005, which FEMSO translated, in which there's a big fight between Gareev, who's saying we need this mobilization base, and the people who I will call technicians, a fellow by the name of Slipchenko, who's dead, who said, no, what Russia has to prepare for is sixth generation of warfare, and sixth generation of warfare is automated command and control, reconnaissance fire, and reconnaissance strike systems, and, if you will, in April 1991, at the U.S. Army War College, we had 6 Russian general officers. This was right after the ground campaign in Iraq. Shevchenko is one of the people there. He said, what we saw in Iraq was the harbinger of 6th generation warfare. Now, if you know anything about our discussions, we talk about 4 generations, and our 4th is something like fighting terrorism. The Russians have a 5th. They have general mechanized industrial war, which is 4, and then they have a 5th, which I don't see anybody in our military literature talking about. It's called thermonuclear war. And now they have a 6th, which is dominated by advanced technologies, and which is supposed to, in fact, be what war will be like by 2020. And the target for the Russians in terms of rearmament has, in fact, to have those sort of systems by 2020. I suspect they're talking now about 2025 because things aren't coming as fast as they'd like. But nonetheless, they see a fundamental transformation of the way warfare is going to be fought. And Henry said about missiles, absolutely. Putin's response to the end of INF, Those calibers that are now on Russian warships are now going to become ground-based. And yes, there is a cruise missile, what is basically an Iskander with a cruise missile on the end of it. That's probably what they're talking about. The Russians spent a whole lot between 1991 and 2010 rebuilding their nuclear force. They started out with a force which was predominantly liquid fueled. It is no more. They're solid fuel. They have a new generation of ballistic missile submarines. They're not coming off as fast as they'd like, but they are very interesting in that you have a mix of solid fuels, the Bulava, and a mix of liquid fuels designed by the Navy's Chief Design Bureau. And it is all part of a posture in which the force is divided between the Far East and Northern Fleet. They've done the same thing with their ground forces, and they have invested heavily in short-range ballistic missile systems, and now look like they're going to go very heavily and openly into what are intermediate range. So nuclear is in the equation, but they are also clearly talking about a role in place for conventional forces. The Achilles heel is manpower. They had a tremendous shortfall of population in the 1990s. It recovered in terms of birth rate in the first decade of Putin's rule, but it has gone down. And I don't think they're going to have the bodies for echelonment, as understood in the Soviet period, where the military districts turn out new divisions, new divisions, new divisions. And what that leads to, if you don't have the forces in the pipeline, you're left with something called escalation. One of the things in military science you might find interesting is one of the big fights in the Soviet military between 1976 and the end of the Soviet Union was a very simple question the General Staff asked in 1976 and got an answer it didn't like and kept asking it again and again. The question was, what is the optimum number of nuclear weapons in a general offensive in Western Europe? And guess what the operations research people said? Because you can't control escalation. You don't know how the other side's going to respond. And the General Staff didn't like that, but that remained the answer of the system study. Right now, you're talking about a military which probably doesn't have long legs. It may be organized for it, but protractedness, I don't think it's going to be its long suit. And therefore, a conflict, a general conflict, we go from 6th generation warfare to possibly 5th generation relatively rapidly. That's my remarks.